The ultimate presenter this semester is Dr. Lisa Casanova, who is also an urban health affiliated faculty member, and she is on the faculty of the School of Public Health here in environmental health. And Dr. Casanova's academic training is in environmental health and does a lot of really cool work on microbiology and environmental factors involved in spreading diseases. And she's also come up with this project to look at infrastructure and water quality and how that impacts our health. So I think that's what she's going to talk about for the next hour. So Dr. Casanova, would you like questions as you go or save them for the end?
As I go.
Okay, all right, so you have until noon to cover this topic.
Okay, yeah, feel free to ask questions anytime during the presentation. So I'm Lisa Casanova. I know a lot of you. I am an environmental health microbiologist. That's my training. And my primary interest is in understanding how infectious diseases move through the environment and how we run into them as they do so. And it's useful a lot of times to think about infectious diseases in the environment and us moving in cycles. Sometimes these cycles are very complex, but they're cycles nevertheless. And one very, very important cycle of infectious disease in the environment is through water, drinking water, wastewater, stormwater, all kinds of water. And the urban environment is a unique place for observing this in action. Now, a lot of this presentation is going to be focused on the city of Atlanta because it's a fascinating story as far as urban water quality, pollution, urban environmental restoration. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the city of Atlanta and our water issues as an example of urban water issues that are common to a lot of large cities all over the world. But one of the things that we think about in the urban environment or don't think about is infrastructure. It underlies everything we do every day, and often we don't think about it. And water infrastructure is no exception. In what we would call probably a developed country like the US, living in a large city, we take our water supply very much for granted. Many, many people in the world today, in fact, almost 1 billion people in the world today, their water situation is that they take it where they can get it. That may be lakes, streams, rivers, sources that are dangerous, sources that are contaminated, sources that spread waterborne disease, sources that they have to travel to and carry water back to their homes because there's no such thing as piped supply. In an urban area like Atlanta or in many places in the United States, we have near universal coverage by infrastructure. And that means two things. It means the water is of sufficient quality. It's clean. It's highly treated. When it gets to you, it's very unlikely that it's going to make you ill. And the second thing is that it's present in sufficient quantity. You have clean water 24 hours a day, as much of it as you want, whenever you turn on a tap. So those two key characteristics of quality and quantity, that's what infrastructure brings us. Clean water, as much of it as we want, anytime we want it. And all we have to do is turn on the tap. And we do take that very much for granted in places like Atlanta. But we also tend to be very complacent about it. Well, our water supply is clean, right? The water comes out of the tap, it's great. When we flush the toilet, it goes somewhere. Who knows where? It just goes. You don't have to worry about it. When you visit perhaps some other countries and you flush the toilet, you feel a little guilty because you wonder, where is this going in the absence of infrastructure? But we have a lot of complacency about that in a place like Atlanta. Well, we have a good water supply, right? Someone is taking care of it. And we often don't think about it. So who lives actually in the city of Atlanta? Who lives outside city? Who knows where your drinking water comes from? And the tap is not the answer. Chattahoochee River? Where else? What's our main water storage reservoir around here? Lake Lanier. So that's good. People do know that. In a general sense, our principal sources of drinking water supply in the metro Atlanta area are the Chattahoochee River. There are many, many drinking water intakes along the Chattahoochee. It's a major water source not only for the metro Atlanta area, but for about 4 million Georgians who live in various places along the river as it runs through the state of Georgia down toward the Panhandle. And Lake Lanier, which is where we sort of keep drinking water. That's why, if you remember the drought from several years ago, there was a lot of concern about the level of the lake going progressively down because it's a major drinking water reservoir. With the major rains over the summer, there are actually worries about the level of the lake being too high, but it can be sort of a feast or a famine kind of thing. But Lake Lanier is the principal place where we store drinking water, but the Chattahoochee River is a major, major source. So your treated sewage, where does it go? Where do we discharge our treated sewage effluent to? Ocean. Well, that is done in some places. We are too far inland for that. Well, your sewage goes to a treatment facility. It's highly treated. You get what's called tertiary effluent, which is basically liquid that has been treated so that it's free of organic matter, it's free of disease-causing microorganisms, and then it's discharged. Where? The Chattahoochee River. So water comes out, goes back in. And this is common of many major bodies of water in the US. Now, you may have heard there's an old saying, and John has probably heard this a lot of times. People used to say dilution is the solution to pollution. Anyone ever heard that saying? Yeah, we used to think that. That's not really the way it works. A more accurate way to put it would be that everything you dump comes back to you in the end. It's part of the way that infectious diseases tend to cycle through the environment. So there's really no such thing as, we'll just dump this into a large enough body of water, it will go away, and all our worries are gone. Now, you mentioned ocean. We actually used to do a lot of ocean discharge of sewage. In the US and coastal areas, it used to be thought that you could discharge sewage that wasn't even very well treated, that all you needed was a long enough pipe that went far enough out into the ocean, and out of sight, out of mind, dilution is the solution to pollution. And then people started studying this phenomenon and discovered that you put it out into the ocean, and what happens? It comes right back to you. Some people did some really fascinating studies on this. For example, there were some really famous studies done down in the Florida Keys, where a lot of people who lived there had septic tanks. So they thought, well, our waste is fine, it's contained in these septic tanks, right? So some microbiologists went and they took these harmless viruses that are really easy to find. They made lots of them. They went around to people's houses. They flushed these viruses down people's toilets. And then they went out into the ocean in a boat and they waited. And they sampled the water and they sampled the water. And sure enough, the viruses started coming up because people's septic tanks were leaking. And they were going straight into the ocean. So really, everything you dump is going to come back to you in the end. There's no such thing as, we'll just put it into a large enough body of water and it goes away. And Atlanta and the Chattahoochee River are prime examples of this. It is the site of both drinking water intakes and sewage effluent discharge points, and that's typical of large rivers in the US. There are many uses. One man's sewage effluent discharge is another man's drinking water intake. And that's why urban infrastructure is so critical, because urban areas have unique characteristics that cause us to pollute the water around us in ways that don't happen in areas that aren't home to concentrated population, large roads, tall buildings, and extensive ground cover. So specifically in Atlanta, so this is an early picture. The city of Atlanta is covered by sanitary sewer system. So all of the buildings, sinks, toilets, and everything are connected to pipes. Pipes carry the sewage away to drinking water or to sewage treatment plants. But how old is the sewage system in the city? Anybody know?
Like 190.
Its construction of it actually started, this is one of the early pictures, in the 1890s. So some parts of the city of Atlanta sewer system date back that far. So we've had sewage infrastructure in the city for a very long time. But the challenge with infrastructure is that it must always keep up with growth. So as your city grows, so must your sewage system. And this has been a major struggle for the city of Atlanta over time. Now, infrastructure, widespread water and sewage infrastructure is really one of the great public health achievements of the last 150 years or so. And I've always thought that this is a fascinating figure in terms of historical thinking about disease. Typhoid fever. So this is caused by Salmonella typhi. It is spread by what we refer to as the fecal-oral route, which is exactly what it sounds like. Water or food gets contaminated by pathogenic organisms that are shed in feces, people eat or drink it, the cycle of disease continues. So typhoid fever used to be very, very common. It's a very dangerous disease. It's still common today in a lot of parts of the world. And really, the decrease in United States rates of typhoid fever tracks our achievements in large-scale water and sanitation infrastructure coverage. And you can see that two critical developments were the beginning of filtering our water supply, so bringing drinking water into centralized treatment plants where the entire supply was filtered before it went out to consumers in a piped system, and then the beginning of large-scale chlorination of the water supply. Together, those two things have virtually eliminated typhoid fever in the United States. And here's just another illustration of that. So you can see, usually we mark around the 1910s, 1920s, the time when large-scale chlorination and treatment of the drinking water supply really started spreading through large cities in the US. And so by 1960, typhoid fever was virtually unknown. And this was because of two things, centralized treatment of the drinking water supply and the adequate sanitary management of our sewage, because those two are interlinked. If you don't have adequate sewage treatment and sanitary disposal of human sewage, it's really, really difficult to keep your water supply clean. So those two advances really go in tandem in US history. And together, they've driven the rates of a lot of waterborne diseases way, way down compared to what they are in other parts of the world where people drink from unsafe supplies. So the city of Atlanta's sewage system, because what I want to focus on here is sewage infrastructure and the role it plays in the urban environment. The city of Atlanta's sewage system, and we're just talking here about the metro area. When we're talking about Atlanta, there's the city itself, there's the suburbs, the many towns around it, and so we're talking about a huge amount of infrastructure. But the city itself, there's 4 treatment plants just to handle everyone's sewage, storage tanks, 12 pump stations. You try to build sewage systems ideally so that everyone's sewage flows downhill by gravity to the plant, but that's not always possible. So there's a network of pump stations in the pipe system and over 2,700 miles of pipes. So we're talking a giant infrastructure undertaking that not only had to be built, it has to be maintained, and it has to be expanded as the population grows. And that's a huge challenge that's facing a lot of urban areas in the US today. Our infrastructure is not only large, but on the whole, it's old. And so the need to maintain old and very extensive infrastructure is really catching up with us today. Now, again, in the past, we were often very complacent about the quality of our drinking water supply. It goes to a plant. We get 24-hour-a-day piped water. It's clean. We have no worries. This was really shaken up in the 90s. And those of you who've gone through my environmental health class recognize this paper. There was a Canadian scientist named Pierre Paiement who did a study where what he did was he recruited hundreds of households from, it was Montreal. And he randomized them into 2 groups, and he told one group to just do what they always done, and he gave the other group water filters for their house so that everything they drank, all the tap water they drank from their house, had gone through a filter, so that if there was anything in the tap water, it was caught in that filter. The other group just drank regular tap water, And what he discovered was that the people who just drank their regular tap water had more diarrheal disease than the people he had given filters to. So this suggested that we were overconfident in the quality of our piped water supply, and that really waterborne disease was not something that we'd totally vanquished, that we couldn't afford to be complacent, that our treatment plants were just always delivering perfectly clean water to our consumers. And this was followed not long after by the biggest waterborne disease outbreak in US history, which happened in the city of Milwaukee in 1993, when a combination of environmental conditions and treatment plant failure led to an outbreak of a waterborne disease, cryptosporidium, that sickened almost 400,000 people before it was brought under control by completely shutting down one of the city's 2 drinking water treatment plants. So these 2 things together really demonstrated that we couldn't afford to not be vigilant about the quality and safety of our drinking water supply, and that even the latest technology in treatment plants wasn't always enough to make sure that we were free of waterborne disease. And there's a focus on this in Atlanta, too. These are just a couple of approaches that people are using now to study the problem of waterborne disease in Atlanta. Now, waterborne disease is a difficult thing to track. It's a very underreported phenomena. A lot of people who have just diarrheal disease may never make contact with the healthcare system when they're ill. It's hard to connect sporadic cases of diarrheal disease to the water supply. So some of the approaches that people have used, particularly in Atlanta, is looking at things like emergency department visits. So when people visit the emergency room for complaints that might be related to waterborne disease, can we correlate this with characteristics of the drinking water supply? So today, we're putting more effort into monitoring to ask, do we have cases of waterborne disease out there that might be connected to our drinking water supply that we're not necessarily noticing because they aren't part of large outbreaks of disease? And this one on the bottom, this is diarrheal and illness increased after release of undertreated sewage. Well, we don't do that, right? We don't just dump sewage in the US, right? Actually, we do. It's called a combined sewer overflow, and I'm going to get to that later, because one of the things that happens with aging infrastructure that's not keeping up with population growth is that we have sewage systems that can't handle all of the waste that we're producing. And this has been, in the past, a major environmental pollution issue for the city of Atlanta. And I like to use this in my classes because it's a good example of how we think about the cycle of infectious disease through the environment. And this focuses on water and other sources, but really it all starts with excreta from humans and animals. So the beginning of it all is the inadequate disposal of human and animal waste. If we can't adequately handle our own sewage, then we are going to have trouble keeping the environment clean and controlling the spread of infectious diseases. So the most obvious thing is the dumping of sewage into rivers and lakes that we use for drinking water supply. There's also the contamination of groundwater by sewage. This can happen when you have things like pipes breaking, when you have leaking septic tanks, which is a major issue in a state like Georgia, where there's a lot of rural population that lives in places that are not connected to city systems. They have things like wells and septic tanks. But another one of the issues is runoff. So in a place like Atlanta, one of the things that characterizes the urban environment is that we cover the ground with things, buildings, sidewalks, roads, highways, parking lots. We have a lot of what's called impermeable ground cover. And when you have a combination of all of this ground cover, roads, sidewalks, buildings, pavement, and a lot of rain, then you have a problem with where all that rain is going to go. So imagine all this rain we had during the summer. Every time it rains in the city of Atlanta, we've covered a lot of the ground. If we didn't, then the rain might soak into the ground and might not be a problem. But in a large city, what does all that rainwater do? It runs off of building roofs. It runs over the streets, it runs over the sidewalks, it runs over people's yards. And where does it go? Yeah, so we have storm drains here. We have lots of storm drains. All of this runoff goes into those drains, and it goes where? Treatment plant, Chattahoochee, actually both of those answers are correct. When we cover places with impermeable ground cover, which is part of the nature of cities, we create a runoff problem from stormwater. And you can think about all of that stormwater. It has everything that came off the roof of every building. It has all the grease and oil and dirt from every street. It has every person who didn't pick up after their dog and every free-roaming cat in the city and whatever they've left on the ground. All of that is swept with this stormwater into the storm drains, and it has to go somewhere. And in a place like Atlanta, we create a lot of it because so much of the ground is covered with impermeable cover that all of this runoff has got to go somewhere. And so it becomes part of our wastewater problem in a way that it doesn't in places where there's a lot of uncovered ground for rainwater to soak into. So runoff it's a problem in a lot of places, but it is one of the issues that is always of concern in the urban environment because all of the runoff from all of our roofs and streets and parking lots and everything has got to go somewhere, and we've got to do something with it. And for example, when you see oceans there, I have a colleague who lives in the city of Baltimore, and he talked about how they had this huge snow, and in a place like Baltimore where they're prepared for weather, when it snows, they go out and, what do they do with the streets? They put salt everywhere. They salt everything. And then they plow all the snow up, and he said, you know what they did with all that snow they plowed? They push it into the bay. So again, everything that was on the streets and roads and sidewalks and everything, plus all of that salt, we'll just push it into the bay. Not an optimal approach to that problem, but another example of how in the urban environment, that kind of runoff is something that has to be handled. In that case, handled badly, but you have to have a solution for that kind of thing. So back to Atlanta, who looks closely at your water bills? Okay. What are you mostly paying for? Sewers. Yeah. So if you look at your water bill, you're paying a little bit for water, you're paying a lot for sewer. In fact, here's from the AJC, and this is a couple years old. Some of our water and sewer rates are among the nation's highest. And this is always interesting because there's very much a perception in the US that water should be cheap. We don't pay nearly what it costs for our water. In a lot of places, it is artificially cheap. But in Atlanta, our rates are among the nation's highest. And why do we pay so much for sewers? Because we have so much runoff and waste? Yeah, partly because we have so much runoff and waste. We pay a lot for sewers because they need a lot of fixing.
Are we mandated to do that?
Yes, and actually that is the next important point about why you pay so much for water and sewers is because the city of Atlanta has to. They are mandated to upgrade the city's sewer system, and there are a lot of reasons for this. So some of the challenges of urban infrastructure. In the US, one of the big ones is that our infrastructure, and this isn't just water infrastructure, it goes for roads and bridges and all kinds of things, is that it's just old. It was built a lot of years ago, and ongoing maintenance is a significant cost for a water utility. They basically have two kinds of costs. They have capital costs. We're going to build a new plant. we're going to lay new pipe, and then they have ongoing maintenance costs. And those can be very expensive as pipes and plants age. They have to be replaced, they have to be upgraded. And there's also the costs of things like natural disasters. During Hurricane Katrina, it took out the water and sewer plants in New Orleans. This was just when there were the big floods in, I think it was 2008, and they had so much water that it flooded the sewage treatment plants. And when this happened, what you end up with is untreated sewage. And when all of that water goes away, where does it go? It goes into the local waterways. It takes all of the sewage with it. So infrastructure is not only ongoing maintenance, keeping up the plants, keeping up the pipes, but nowadays we've realized that it's also the need to be prepared for disasters, for large weather events, making the infrastructure so that it can withstand things like this when they happen. So the history of why you pay so much for your sewer bills. This is a schematic of where water comes from in the city of Atlanta. So there are two big water treatment plants that serve the area. It's the Chattahoochee Water Treatment Plant and the Hemp Hill Water Treatment Plant. And you can see the Chattahoochee, one of the reasons that it's both such a useful and such a vulnerable body of water is that you can see it runs right past the edge of the city of Atlanta as it flows down towards the Alabama border. So it's both convenient to us and it's really vulnerable to the bad things that we can do to it because it's so close to such a major urban area. And in the city of Atlanta, we have historically done a bad job of protecting the river. And one of the things that you mentioned is a mandate to improve the city's sewer system. So why do you pay so much money for your sewer charges? It all started with a lawsuit. In 1998, the city of Atlanta was sued by a couple of different bodies. The EPA took part, an organization called the Chattahoochee Riverkeeper, some citizens who live downriver of the city of Atlanta. They got together and they sued the city for violating the Clean Water Act. Now, how did we do this? Well, the city sewer system is divided into two different kinds. So when you look at a major urban sewer system, you can have two different kinds of systems. You can have a sanitary system or you can have a combined system. So if you have a sanitary system, it's sometimes called a separated system, it means that sewage, toilets, sinks, all that kind of stuff, go to one place, go to the treatment plants, storm water goes into the storm drains, and it goes to another place. In some places that have separated sewer systems, sewage goes to the sewage treatment plant, and storm drains go straight to the nearest local body of surface water, a lake or a river. But the other kind of sewer system that you can have is called a combined sewer system. If you have a combined sewer system, your sewage and your storm water all go to the same place. They all go to the same pipes. They all go to the same treatment plant. And large parts of the city of Atlanta had a combined sewer system. Combined sewer systems were pretty common in the old days when a lot of urban sewer systems were originally put in. Combined sewer systems were thought to be the way to go. So all the sewage, all the storm drains go into the same pipes. It all goes to the same treatment plant. And that's fine up to a point. When you build a sewage treatment plant, it's rated for a particular capacity. And we usually talk about treatment plant capacity in terms of millions of gallons per day. So that's how much sewage it can treat in a typical day. So you may build a treatment plant and it's rated to handle 40 million gallons a day. So you figure out how many people live here, how many people are served by the system, how big does the treatment plant need to be, so how much sewage are they going to produce. So we'll build a plant that can handle 40 million gallons a day. Well, that's fine as long as you go along and your population is producing 40 million gallons of sewage a day, you're okay. But if you have a combined sewer system, and let's say that it rains 3 inches in a single day, and all of the sewage and all of the stormwater is going into the same system, well, all of a sudden, you have 50 million gallons in a single day going to your treatment plant. And then you have a problem because you've overwhelmed the capacity of your plant. And what do? Is anybody familiar with this story and know what actually happens when you exceed the capacity of your plant? You dump or flood. So once you hit 40 million gallons, you flip the switch. And whatever's coming in after that, you divert it. And a lot of times where you divert it to is the nearest surface water source. So what Atlanta ended up doing was essentially every time there was a heavy rain, they were diverting massive quantities of untreated human sewage into the Chattahoochee River because heavy rains overwhelmed the capacity of the city's sewage treatment plants. And that's called a combined sewer overflow, or a CSO. And CSOs were really common. I was talking to someone from the Riverkeeper who said that when it was really bad, there could be 70 or 80 CSOs in the space of a single year. Every time that happened, they would flip the switch, they would divert the sewage, it would go straight into the Chattahoochee River. So we were polluting the river with our own untreated sewage because our infrastructure didn't have the capacity to handle the amount of flow that came through when it rained. It couldn't handle the combination of both sewage and stormwater. So this is an example, and I have some more detailed maps later. If you want to find your house or something, you can tell which treatment plants serve where you live, but these are the water treatment facilities that serve the city of Atlanta. So you can see the red arrows, those are 2 in the city proper. And then there's also the Atlanta-Fulton County water treatment plant, which is sort of up to this side. And you can kind of see where I'm going with this. Where do we dump our untreated sewage? Into the Chattahoochee. Where does our drinking water come from? The Chattahoochee. So we were massively polluting our own drinking water source, essentially every time there was a heavy rain. And this is just a schematic of what a combined sewer overflow looks like. So again, in a combined sewer system, all of the sewers, all of the stormwater drains are flowing toward the treatment plant. But once the treatment plant hits capacity, you hit a valve and the overflow just goes into the nearest surface water source. Sometimes I was talking to someone at one of the plants who talked about they used to make an attempt, like basically they dump some chlorine in it. That doesn't really help with just raw human sewage. And then it went out to the streams, the lakes, the river, and created a huge pollution problem. I mean, I've been told from people who were actually around when that happened that when these CSOs happened, you could go down and look at the river and you could see the sewage just floating down it. So a bunch of people got together and they formed an organization called the Upper Chattahoochee Riverkeeper. They got together with some citizens who lived downstream of the city of Atlanta who had standing to say that they were affected by this pollution because it was their drinking water source. They got together and they sued the city for violating the Clean Water Act. That was in 1998. And Atlanta entered into a federal consent decree, which is essentially a settlement that agreed that the city would undertake a huge upgrade of its sewer system in order to stop these CSOs from happening. Now, the biggest issue with CSOs is that you're polluting the drinking water for the people downstream, or likely you're polluting your own drinking water because there are, and if anybody's interested, I have other maps that aren't in this presentation, but if you look at just the sheer number of drinking water treatment plant intakes that are along the urbanized stretches of the Chattahoochee River, you will see that any kind of CSO, practically anywhere on the river, is polluting somebody's drinking water supply. And it's just not enough to have a top-of-the-line treatment plant because even the best water treatment technology can't do everything. So you can't just have completely filthy water and then a really good treatment plant. It doesn't work that way. You have to have both good treatment plants and you have to protect your source water. And that's what the consent decree sought to do. Now, people looked at other consequences of combined sewer overflows other than pollution of drinking water, and those results were really interesting too. There were investigators from UGA, Emory, and CDC who actually found that combined sewer overflows increased the transmission of West Nile virus. So West Nile virus, anybody know where do we get West Nile virus? Mosquitoes. It's a vector-borne disease. But when the quality of our environmental waters also affects the cycles of transmission of vector-borne diseases. Mosquitoes need water sources to live in, and when we pollute those water sources, it appears that we actually increase the transmission cycle of West Nile virus. And so if you go and look at the urban waters around places like Atlanta, you can see that we have a pretty substantial impact on the surface water around us. So this is the layout of what we call water reclamation facilities. So water reclamation is the new fancy word for sewage treatment plant. That's what we call it nowadays. We're not discharging sewage, we're reclaiming water. So water reclamation facilities, sewage treatment plant, and these are the major facilities that serve the city of Atlanta proper. So there's R.M. Clayton, there's South River, there's Utoy Creek. Has anyone ever been to Utoy Creek? Okay, it's a creek that actually runs right through the city. It runs, there's the North and South Utoy Creek, they join together and then they flow out toward the Chattahoochee. And so we have a sewage treatment plant that's right on Utoy Creek. That's where it discharges into. It discharges into that creek, which then carries the discharge out to the Chattahoochee. Then there's R.L. Sutton and Camp Creek. Those also discharge to the Chattahoochee River, as does the Douglas County wastewater treatment plant further downriver. So you can see Camp Creek down there in the corner, and then Douglas County is further down. So this is the treatment plant, the sewage treatment plant network that serves the city. And the main goal of the upgrades that the consent decree mandated and the upgrades that you're paying for on your water bills is to separate the sewage and the storm water flows in the city, so that also to upgrade treatment plant capacity, but also to separate those flows so that we no longer have a problem with combined sewer overflows. So you can see here, it's really just a couple of treatment plants that serve the majority of the metro Atlanta area. And what's going to happen and what's happening now, you see these CSOs, these combined sewer overflow areas. That doesn't mean that combined sewer overflows are happening there. It means that these are the catchment areas where we want to capture the storm water coming from these areas of the city, and we want to divert it so that it's not going to these treatment plants. And that's the cornerstone of these upgrades to the city's system, is building these large underground tunnels and basins so that storm water goes to storm drains, it goes through these tunnels, it goes through these basins, and when the treatment plants are at capacity, the storm water goes directly to surface water sources, rather than going into the treatment plant, overwhelming it, and causing a combined sewer overflow. So this is another looking more closely at the actual city areas. A couple of treatment plants, and one that, you see the number 1 down here on the side, that's the Entrenchment Creek plant. And this is an example. I took a class to visit this plant, and this was one of the areas where they talked about, in the past, they had a huge problem with combined sewer overflows. So what they would do is when the plant hit capacity, they had these large basins, and then they would just start filling up these basins with the overflow. But when the basins filled, they had no choice but to discharge it straight into the creek. So, and many of the small creeks and things like that around just end up running eventually into the Chattahoochee. So all of these treatment plants had these issues with CSOs whenever there was a heavy rain. So what we're doing with this upgrade is, you can see on the bottom there, it talks about CSO facilities, is dividing the city into sections and then saying, okay, for this section, we're going to collect all the stormwater when it rains and divert it to a large underground tunnel or basin where it can then be discharged. So the city is divided into sections of stormwater catchments, and the idea is we keep the stormwater out of the sewer system, discharge it to surface water so that we no longer have CSOs. And you can see one of these examples, this heavy blue line along the bottom, a Three Rivers tunnel, where they're starting to build these tunnels and basins as part of a stormwater handling system. And this is just, if any of you want to see this later, this is one of the better maps I have where you can see, what area of the city do you live in, what's it being served by, and which stormwater catchment do you live in. So you can see that these are the areas that, the sort of divisions of the city where we're thinking about making these sort of stormwater catchments. And if you look, they have a dry weather discharge location and a wet weather discharge location. So that's when the treatment plant is below capacity and when the treatment plant is above capacity. So you can see dry weather discharge location. So when there's dry weather, most of these areas, everything's going to go to the local sewage treatment plant. For a lot of areas of the city, that's RM Clayton. For some, it's Entrenchment Creek. But you can also see that during wet weather, there's a discharge location for the overflow. Proctor Creek, anybody familiar with Proctor Creek? Yeah, it's a pretty important creek in the city of Atlanta. There's the Proctor Creek neighborhood that's around it. They're mobilizing in a major effort to get Proctor Creek cleaned up as a way to revitalize their community and make it a site for recreation and a draw for the neighborhood. And part of that is making sure that Proctor Creek is not a site for combined sewer overflows every time it rains. Entrenchment Creek, that's where the overflow from the Entrenchment Creek sewage treatment plant would go. And the discharge basin. So creeks go to larger rivers, which probably eventually go to the ocean. And so you can see that all these smaller creeks, eventually all of this flow ends up in the Chattahoochee River. And that's when we think about things at the level what we call a watershed, which is a really large area surrounding the Chattahoochee. All of this flow, whether it's combined sewer overflows, whether it's effluent discharges, whether it's stormwater runoff that we don't capture, it all eventually goes back to the Chattahoochee River. So the upgrading of our sewage infrastructure is really critical for keeping the river clean because we have such a huge influence on it as an urban area. And this is basically how the city is going to be divided up for this new stormwater handling system is that different sections of the city will have these catchments, the stormwater, and each of these sections will have this system of tunnels and basins built, and all the stormwater from that section of the city will be captured. It will go into those tunnels and basins so that it's no longer flowing to the sewage treatment plant and causing CSOs. And we've already made a huge amount of progress on this. When I was speaking to the Riverkeeper, which it still exists as an organization, and they're an advocacy organization for the Chattahoochee River, they said that before the city began this system of upgrades, they could have 70 or 80 CSOs a year. Basically, every time it rained, they had one. He said now it's about 4 in the course of a typical year. So we made a huge amount of progress, but that is basically what your water rates are paying for, because often infrastructure upgrades are a very costly undertaking for a water utility. And we're talking here about really a huge infrastructure project to separate the sewer system. Now, not all of Atlanta has a combined sewer system. It's actually only part of the city. So there are a lot of surrounding areas with newer systems where it's not a combined sewer system. It's a separated sewer system, and they don't have this problem. But it's an issue for large cities that have older infrastructure that went in at a time when combined sewer systems were common and no one gave much thought to building things that way, that these issues are catching up as there's population growth, as we have more, as cities get bigger, we cover more of the ground and we have more problems with runoff. These issues are catching up with a lot of urban areas, and Atlanta is just a good example. Because we are so close to the Chattahoochee, we make so many uses of it for drinking, for recreation, for other things, and because there are so many downriver users of the city that the pollution of it became a major, major environmental health issue. So that's sort of the story of the city of Atlanta, the lawsuit, and the Chattahoochee, and we've made a lot of progress in cleaning up the river. We've drastically cut the number of combined sewer overflows. There's been major upgrades of the sewer systems, but we still have the essential problem of runoff because we are a big city covered with buildings and pavement and everything else, and so the issue of stormwater never really goes away for large urban areas, and we keep coming up with better science for managing it. So in a lot of new construction, if you're going to, say, make a large development, you have to prove that you have a system for handling the stormwater, that you aren't just going to pave over everything and let the stormwater run off and become someone else's problem. You have to do things like provide green space and permeable ground for stormwater to go into, or provide detention basins for the stormwater to flow into. And we call these things BMPs, or best management practices, and there's a whole science nowadays of optimal ways to handle stormwater in new construction and new development, and that's become an important part of new building in a lot of urban areas, is not just, well, we'll let it flow off into the storm drains and into tunnels and basins, but how do we handle the issue of stormwater at the source when it's a consequence of the kinds of things that we're building. So this is always going to be an ongoing issue in many urban areas, both how do we keep up with our population growth, how do we keep up with the needs to improve our infrastructure, how do we come up with new ways to handle stormwater and runoff that are unique to the urban environment, because we're so close to many of our surface water sources that we need them, but at the same time, we pollute them, and we have to figure out how to effectively manage that cycle. Questions? Yeah.
Did they look at how that sort of polluted water affects plant life in the sense of sprinkler systems and that sort of thing, or is it not really that big of an issue?
In terms of how polluted water affects plant life, I'm not really familiar with the research about that. When it comes to like aquatic plant life and aquatic life in the river, one of the consequences of CSOs, of dumping sewage into the river, is that it creates what's called biological oxygen demand, which is that it sucks up the oxygen in the water. That's why fish die when you dump things in the river. And it may happen to aquatic plants as well, but that's about all I know. Yeah?
So GSU builds a lot of stuff downtown. Do they take that stuff into consideration? Like, do you know, like, if GSU does anything to sort of, I guess, contribute to solutions for runoff?
At GSU, in terms of new construction, there are a couple different things. I believe that there is some rainwater collection on campus. I mean, one of the things that you can do with new buildings is you can add a cistern and you can just directly capture the rainwater and do something with it. The most common is to either irrigate the landscape or flush the toilets. My old university used to do that with some of their buildings.
Is that like a gray water system, is that what that's called?
That's not a gray water system. Gray water is residential wastewater from everything that's not the toilet,
Okay.
basically. But rainwater is usually different. It tends to be, especially if you're catching it like right off the roof, it tends to be cleaner. So, but I haven't, I've been at GSU since 2010, so John, you might be familiar with more of the building that's been going
Well, I
on.
think you're right about the rainwater. I'm not aware of any other initiatives, but there is an indoor initiative on water conservation in plumbing fixtures, and I'm sure all of you have seen some of that in the bathrooms. And that's campus-wide, so that's a significant amount of water.
Yeah, a lot of times with handling of runoff, the most basic things for new construction are that you have to make sure you're not creating places where water just pools or where it runs off onto somebody else's property, things like that.
There is a campus sustainability organization for students if you're really interested in learning more about this and getting involved. It's called the Sustainability Energy Tribe.
Thank you.